Back in the hardest years when money was tight and nothing could be wasted, our grandparents used simple wisdom to keep food from spoiling. These were not just tricks, they were survival. In this video, we are going to explore 15 food preservation hacks that helped families make it through times of war, poverty, and uncertainty. And the best part, many of these methods still work today, passed down through generations. They remind us that even in struggle, knowledge is power. Let us begin. 1. Root cellars. Before refrigerators were common, root cellars were one of the smartest and most reliable ways families kept food fresh through long winters. These were often small, underground rooms or dugouts, cool, dark, and slightly damp. They used the Earth's natural insulation to maintain a steady temperature year-round. That meant vegetables like potatoes, carrots, onions, beets, turnips, apples, and even cabbages could be stored for months without spoiling. My grandfather told me his father built their root cellar by hand, using stones from the creek and old timber from a barn. Inside, shelves were lined with burlap sacks filled with potatoes, while apples sat in wooden crates layered with straw to prevent bruising. The air always smelled of soil and cool stone, but the food inside meant the family would make it through winter. There was no electricity, no fans, no machines, just knowledge and patience. Families understood exactly how to position each vegetable. Some needed to breathe, others needed to stay dry. A root cellar wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a life-saving storage unit built with love and logic. And even today, many homesteaders and gardeners are bringing this practice back, realizing that sometimes the old ways still work best. 2. Canning in mason jars. Canning was a cornerstone of survival during the hardest years. When food was available, especially fresh fruits or vegetables, families wasted nothing. They preserved what they could using glass mason jars, boiling water baths, and sometimes pressure canners when dealing with low-acid foods like meats or green beans. Canning was more than a task. It was a family ritual. Jars lined the kitchen counters. Berries became jam. Tomatoes turned into sauce. Beans, corn, peaches, and pears all found their way into shining rows on cellar shelves. Even soup and leftover stews were canned, once sealed properly. The food could last a year or more. I remember stories of my great-grandmother spending entire days in the kitchen during harvest season. The stove would run hot, steam fogged the windows, and the clinking of lids sealing would bring a smile to her tired face. When a jar popped, it meant the seal was good, and the food was safe. Canning taught generations how to prepare, how to plan ahead, and how to feed a family when the stores were empty. It was science and care wrapped in one process. Many of those same jars still exist in family homes, handed down through the years, because preservation was never just about food. It was about legacy. 3. Drying meat and fish jerky. Before freezers, drying meat was one of the only ways to preserve it long term. Families made jerky out of beef, venison, pork, or even fish. The process was simple but powerful. Thin slices of meat were salted, sometimes spiced, and left to dry in open air or smoked slowly over a fire. The result? Strips of protein that could last for months without refrigeration. This method saved lives. In rural areas, people hunted in the fall and dried enough meat to carry them through the cold months when fresh meat was hard to find. It was lightweight, portable, and ready to eat. Soldiers carried it, cowboys packed it, and families kept jars or bags of it in their pantries as a safety net, my uncle once said. Jerky was like gold. You could chew it for hours, and it kept you strong. The taste was intense, smoky, salty, tough, but satisfying. Kids would gnaw on a piece after chores. Adults would bring it into the fields. Nothing was wasted. Even the scraps were boiled into broth. Today, jerky is sold in fancy packaging. But back then, It was made by hand, with a string tied across a kitchen or a back porch rack. That dried meat told a story of hard work, tradition, and smart survival. And it worked. 4. Salt curing pork and fatback. Salt curing was one of the most effective preservation hacks known to our grandparents, and especially for pork. In a time when refrigeration was rare or non-existent, salt was the miracle ingredient. It drew out moisture from meat, making it inhospitable to bacteria. It turned fresh pork into something that could last for weeks or even months. Families would butcher hogs in the fall, then pack pieces of meat, especially fatback, hams, or shoulders into wooden barrels layered with salt. Sometimes spices were added for flavor, but salt did the heavy lifting. The meat would cure for several weeks, then get hung to dry, wrapped in cheesecloth, or smoked depending on the region. Salt pork was used to flavor beans, greens, and soups. Even a small piece could stretch a dish and feed a family. Fatback was fried or rendered into lard, and every scrap had a purpose. Salted meat was sometimes rinsed and soaked before cooking to remove the excess salt. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. I once found my grandfather's old curing log in his barn dates, weights, and how long each piece had cured. It was treated like a science, because it was. And it helped keep families fed through the harshest times. Salt was cheap. Meat was precious. And together they made survival possible. 5. Rendering and storing lard. Back in the hardest years, families used every part of what they had, and that included turning animal fat into lard. Lard was more than a cooking fat. It was essential. It could be stored for months, used for frying, baking, or even preserving other foods like meat or vegetables in a method called confit. And because it didn't require refrigeration when stored properly, it became a kitchen staple. After butchering a pig, the fat, especially leaf lard and fatback, would be chopped into small pieces and slowly melted down over low heat. This process is called rendering. As the fat melted, it separated from the cracklings, which were the crispy bits left over and often saved as snacks or toppings. The liquid lard was strained and poured into glass jars, crocks, or metal tins, then cooled and stored in a cool, dark place. My grandmother would keep a jar of lard near the stove, always ready to use. She fried potatoes in it, greased biscuit pans with it, and sometimes even rubbed it into the dough for pie crusts. She said it made everything taste better, and she was right. It gave food that rich, old-fashioned flavor you just can't get from modern oils. Lard was also a preservation tool. Meat covered in lard and stored in jars stayed safe for weeks. It sealed out air and bacteria, buying families more time before food spoiled. In those days, nothing was wasted. What others might throw away today was back then a treasure, and lard, humble as it was, helped keep kitchens running and people full. 6. Fermenting vegetables. Like sauerkraut and pickles, fermentation may sound trendy now, but long before it became a health craze, it was pure survival. Our grandparents relied on fermentation to preserve vegetables through the seasons. Sauerkraut, pickles, and fermented beets were just some of the common foods that stayed good for months without any refrigeration, all thanks to salt and patience. The process was straightforward. Vegetables were chopped and packed into crocks or jars, layered with salt or submerged in saltwater brine. Over time, natural bacteria would convert the sugars in the vegetables into lactic acid, which preserved the food and gave it that tangy flavor. These fermented jars were kept in cool places like root cellars or pantries. Cabbage was especially popular because it was cheap and grew well in most climates. Turning it into sauerkraut meant it would last well into winter and add needed nutrients like vitamin C, my great-aunt would always say. Sauerkraut kept our bellies full and colds away. And indeed, it did more than just flavor meals, it kept families healthy. Pickles weren't just cucumbers, green beans, okra, carrots, and even watermelon rinds were preserved in brine or vinegar. Every family had their own recipe, some sweet, some sour, some with garlic or dill. These jars lined pantry shelves like jewels, each one a small insurance policy against hunger. Fermenting was practical, but it also brought families together. Kids helped slice, parents stirred and checked the jars, and when the bubbles started to rise and the smell turned sharp, everyone knew the process had worked. A little salt and thyme could create food that lasted and taught patience, care, and trust in nature. 7. Hanging herbs to dry. Herbs may seem small, but during the hardest years, they played a big role. They added flavor when meals were plain, and many were used as simple remedies for colds, coughs, or upset stomachs. Since fresh herbs could not be found year-round, families dried their own. It was a slow, natural process, and one that connected people to the rhythms of the land. After harvest, herbs like thyme, sage, oregano, mint, rosemary, and basil were bundled into small bunches and tied with string. These bundles were hung upside down in kitchens, barns, or porches anywhere dry and out of direct sunlight, over days or weeks. The leaves would dry completely, becoming crumbly and aromatic. My grandmother had a row of drying herbs over her kitchen window every time the wind blew through. The room filled with the scent of mint or basil. She kept the dried leaves in labeled jars, reused year after year. These jars weren't fancy. Sometimes they were old jelly jars or tin cans, but they held more than flavor. They held memory. Dried herbs were sprinkled into stews, soups, and teas. Mint went into water or was brewed to calm the stomach. Sage added richness to broth. Oregano lifted plain beans into something special. And beyond cooking, herbs were symbols of tradition gathered, dried, and shared among neighbors. Drying herbs taught us not to overlook the small things. A handful of leaves, hung with care, could brighten a whole winter. And when you opened a jar months later and caught that familiar scent, it was like being wrapped in memory. 8. Making apple cider vinegar from scraps. One of the most resourceful hacks from the Depression era was turning apple scraps, cores, and peels into vinegar. Nothing went to waste, not even the parts of the fruit that most people throw away. Families saved them, fermented them, and created homemade apple cider vinegar that could be used for food, cleaning, and even health. The process started in the fall, when apples were being peeled for pies, sauces, or canning. The leftover peels and cores were placed in large jars or crocks, covered with water, and stirred with a bit of sugar. Then they were left to sit, covered loosely with cloth, in a warm spot for several weeks. Over time, natural yeasts would turn the sugar into alcohol, and then into vinegar. It smelled sharp, but it worked. Once it was strained and bottled, the vinegar was stored in dark glass bottles or reused jars. It could be added to pickles, sprinkled on greens, or used to clean windows. Some people even drank it diluted for its believed health benefits. My great-uncle used to say, "If you've got vinegar, you've got power." And in many ways, he was right. It preserved, it cleaned, it cured. Vinegar from scraps was a symbol of making something from nothing, a reminder that value can be found in the overlooked and discarded. Even today, making your own vinegar connects you to that spirit of self-reliance and gratitude. It costs almost nothing, takes just a bit of patience, and leaves you with a product that keeps giving. In tough times or good, it's a tradition worth keeping alive. Number 9. Smoking meat over wood fires before freezers, before plastic wrap. Before refrigeration of any kind, there was smoke. Smoking meat was one of the oldest and most trusted ways to preserve it, and our grandparents knew how to do it right. This wasn't just for flavor. It was a way to make sure nothing spoiled, and every ounce of meat lasted as long as possible. Smokehouses were common across farms and rural homes. They were small sheds, usually built of wood or stone, with a fire pit on one end and meat hanging from the rafters above. Over days, sometimes weeks, the meat was slowly smoked over hardwood like hickory, applewood, or oak. The result was food that could last weeks or even months. Hams, sausages, bacon, and fish were often cured first with salt, then smoked. This two-step process, salt to remove moisture, smoke to seal and protect, gave meat its deep flavor and long shelf life. My great-grandfather had a smokehouse out back, and every fall, the whole family helped prep the meat. They tied it, rubbed it with cure, and hung it with care. The smell of wood smoke clinging to the meat became a kind of promise. You knew that in the cold months ahead, there would be something rich and hearty to eat. Even just a slice of smoked ham could flavor an entire pot of beans or soup. Smoking meat was not fast. It required patience, knowledge, and trust in the process. But the reward was food that didn't just fill your belly. It filled your spirit. It connected families to the land, the season, and each other. 10. Storing eggs in lime water. Fresh eggs are fragile things, but in the days before refrigeration, families found a way to make them last sometimes up to 6 months or more. The secret lime water? It might sound odd today, but our grandparents swore by it, and for many rural families, it was the only way to enjoy eggs in the dead of winter. Lime water is made by mixing pickling lime, also known as calcium hydroxide, with clean water. When eggs were fresh and unwashed, they were gently placed in a crock or large jar filled with this lime water solution. The lime sealed the porous shells and prevented air and bacteria from entering. As long as the eggs were handled carefully, they could last well into the colder months. My grandmother used to keep a stoneware crock of eggs in the pantry under the stairs. She always reminded us not to wash the eggs before storing them, because the natural coating, the bloom, helped keep them safe. When she pulled one out for cooking, it was like finding a treasure. This method wasn't fancy, but it worked. It gave families a reliable source of protein when chickens stopped laying in the cold. It kept breakfast going. It made baking possible, even when the stores were empty. In modern times, we take eggs for granted. But back then, preserving them was an act of planning, of resourcefulness, and of love. It was one more way our elders made sure no one went without even in the hardest seasons. 11. Making fruit leather. When fruit was abundant, especially in summer, families worked fast to preserve every bit of it. They canned it. They dried it. They made jam. But one of the most clever and beloved methods was fruit leather. Sweet, chewy, and long-lasting. It turned leftover fruit into a treat that kids and adults both enjoyed. The process was simple. Overripe or bruised fruit was peeled and mashed into a puree, sometimes with a bit of honey or sugar. The puree was then spread thin onto wax paper or cloth and left to dry in the sun or in a warm oven. Once it was leathery and no longer sticky, it was rolled up and stored for later. Apples, peaches, plums, and berries all worked well. My great-aunt used to spread the fruit on clean window screens and set them out on the porch, covered with thin cloth to keep bugs away. The smell was incredible sweet, fresh, alive, and when it was ready, she'd cut the leather into strips and store them in jars or tins. Fruit leather didn't just save fruit from going to waste. It gave kids something to look forward to in winter. It was healthy, homemade, and full of love. No wrappers, no preservatives, just pure fruit and sunlight. Today, fruit leather is sold in stores in plastic packaging. But the real thing, the way our grandparents made it, was better in every way. Simpler, cleaner, and filled with intention. It was another way to say, we made the most of what we had. 12. Storing onions and garlic in braids. Onions and garlic have been essential kitchen staples for generations, but long before mesh bags and refrigerators. Our grandparents had a simple, beautiful solution braiding. After harvesting, they would braid the stems of onions and garlic and hang them in cool, dry spaces like barns, basements, or porches. This method kept them well ventilated, preventing rot and mold. The process began right after the vegetables were pulled from the soil. They were left to dry for several days until the stems were soft but not brittle. Then, using careful hands, the stalks were woven together in thick, sturdy braids. These braids were then looped over beams or hooks and left to hang through the season. My grandfather had a row of braided garlic hanging in his shed every fall. It wasn't just practical, it was almost decorative. Each braid represented the success of the harvest, the work of hands that had tilled and tended the land. And when winter came, all you had to do was cut off a bulb when you needed it. Garlic and onions stored this way could last for months. They were used to flavor soups, stews, roasts, and even medicinal teas. And because they were kept dry and out of direct light, they held their strength and quality well into spring. This method of preservation is almost forgotten today, but it is worth remembering. It teaches patience, care, and a certain reverence for the food we grow. Sometimes the old ways are the smartest ways, and braiding onions is proof of that. 13. Wax sealing jams and jellies. Before modern canning lids with rubber seals and snap tops, our grandparents relied on a simpler, elegant solution wax. Wax sealing was the go-to method for preserving jams, jellies, and fruit spreads, especially in the first half of the 20th century. It was easy, inexpensive, and for many families, it was the difference between wasting food and saving it for the long months ahead. After making jam, often from homegrown strawberries, blackberries, or peaches, women would carefully pour the hot mixture into sterilized glass jars. Then, while the jam was still warm, they would melt paraffin wax and pour a thin layer over the surface. Once cooled, the wax hardened, forming an airtight seal that kept out mold and bacteria. My great-grandmother kept shelves lined with jewel-toned jars, each topped with a soft white disc of wax. She always said, "If it jiggles, it's still good." We'd open a jar in winter, break through the wax with a butter knife, and release the scent of summer berries. It was like opening a memory. The wax wasn't just functional, it was beautiful. Some families even tied cloth over the lids with string and labeled them by hand. These jars weren't just stored, they were treasured. Wax sealing taught generations that, with a little care and attention, food could last far beyond its season. It gave families sweetness in hard times and something joyful to look forward to. Today, few people use this method, but its charm and simplicity still inspire those who value tradition. 14. Keeping butter fresh in water. Buttercrocks refrigerators were rare during the Depression and wartime years, especially in rural areas. But even without cold storage, our grandparents still found ways to keep butter fresh. One clever method was storing it in water using what's known as a buttercrock or butterbell. It's simple science, and it worked. A buttercrock consists of two parts. The base holds water, the lid, shaped like a small cup, holds the butter. When the lid is inverted and placed into the base, the water creates an airtight seal, preventing air and bacteria from reaching the butter. This method kept butter soft, spreadable, and safe to eat even in warm kitchens. My grandfather, who grew up on a dairy farm, said his mother kept a buttercrock right on the windowsill. She changed the water daily and never worried about spoilage, even in the heat of summer. They had fresh butter on bread, biscuits, and vegetables. Butter was precious. It was churned by hand, saved carefully, and used sparingly. Losing it to spoilage was not an option. So the buttercrock became a quiet hero of the Depression kitchen. What this method shows us is that preservation is often about simple solutions, not fancy tools. It's about understanding how nature works and using it to your advantage. A bit of water, a ceramic jar, and daily care that was enough to keep something as delicate as butter safe and useful. Today, butter bells have made a comeback, and for good reason. They remind us that the old ways weren't just clever, they were effective and deeply rooted in care and tradition. 15. Bartering preserved goods with neighbors. In the hardest years, survival wasn't just about what you had, it was also about what you were willing to share. And one of the most beautiful, often forgotten food preservation hacks was not a technique at all, but a tradition bartering. When families preserved food, canned peaches, smoked ham, pickled beans, they often made enough to trade with neighbors. A jar of jam could be swapped for a dozen eggs. Dried apples might be traded for lard or flour. Everyone had something, but no one had everything. Bartering turned scarcity into strength, and neighbors into extended family. My grandmother told me stories of how people would walk down dirt roads carrying baskets of goods, wrapped in cloth or packed in old wooden crates. There was no shame in needing something. There was pride in having something to offer. A handshake sealed the deal, and a shared meal often followed. This exchange system wasn't just about food. It was about trust, respect, and the belief that community matters. Bartering meant fewer wasted goods. It meant everyone ate a little better, and perhaps most importantly, it meant no one had to face hard times alone in today's fast-paced world. We forget the power of those simple exchanges, but bartering was a form of preservation too, not just of food, but of relationships and resilience. It reminds us that generosity has always been one of our strongest survival skills. And maybe that's the greatest hack of all when we help one another. We all get through the winter together,